It is necessary for a prince to know well how to use the beast and the man. He should choose the fox and the lion. Niccolo Machiavelli. I learned this lesson the hard way when I was 26, working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized tech company in Austin. My colleague Jake and I started on the same day, had similar backgrounds, and honestly, he wasn't any smarter than me. But within 18 months, Jake was leading client presentations while I was still organizing spreadsheets. The difference wasn't our work quality, it was how we presented ourselves to the world. Jake understood what Machiavelli meant about being both fox and lion. His LinkedIn profile looked like a CEO's, complete with professional headshots and carefully crafted posts about industry trends. Meanwhile, my profile had a casual photo from a barbecue and maybe 3 posts total. When clients visited our office, Jake dressed like he already had the promotion he wanted, spoke with quiet confidence, and somehow made everyone remember his name. I showed up in khakis and hoped my work would speak for itself. The wake-up call came during a team meeting when our VP, Sarah, mentioned she was looking for someone to represent us at a major conference in Denver. Without hesitation, she looked directly at Jake. "You've got the right presence for this kind of event," she said. I watched my opportunity walk out the door because I'd failed to build the image that commands respect. That night, I went home and studied every successful person's digital presence I could find. What I discovered changed everything. Your reputation precedes you into every room, literally. Before anyone hears you speak, they've already decided if you're worth listening to based on what they see online. Franklin Roosevelt understood this when he carefully controlled his image during his radio broadcasts, never letting Americans see his wheelchair. Today, your first impression happens on Google search results, not in person. I spent the next 6 months completely rebuilding my professional image. New headshots, consistent posting schedule, and most importantly, I started sharing insights instead of just accomplishments. I analyzed what successful people in my field talked about and began adding my own perspective to industry conversations. The transformation wasn't just digital. I started dressing for the role I wanted and speaking up in meetings with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The results were undeniable. Within 8 months, I was leading my own team and presenting to C-level executives. During my promotion interview, our CEO mentioned he'd been following my insights on LinkedIn and was impressed by my thought leadership. It wasn't about being fake. It was about strategically showcasing the competence I'd always had, but never properly displayed. But here's what most people get wrong about building their image. They think it's about perfection. Actually, controlled vulnerability works better than flawless facades. I shared my failures alongside my wins, asked thoughtful questions instead of pretending to know everything, and showed people the person behind the professional. This authenticity, combined with consistent quality, created trust that pure polish never could. The key insight from Machiavelli is that perception shapes reality. More than reality shapes perception. People make decisions about your competence in 7 seconds, long before they understand your actual capabilities. This isn't shallow, it's human nature. Your brain processes visual information 60,000 times faster than text, so your appearance and presence literally reach people's decision-making centers before your words do. Today, I help other professionals understand this principle. The most talented person in the room doesn't always win. The person with the best combination of talent and presentation wins. I've seen brilliant engineers passed over for promotions because they couldn't articulate their value, and I've watched average performers succeed because they understood how to position themselves strategically. The digital age has amplified this reality exponentially. Your online presence is now your personal kingdom, and like any ruler, you must be intentional about how you govern it. Every post, photo, and interaction either builds or diminishes your authority. The fox in you plans each move carefully. The lion in you executes with confidence that commands attention. This lesson about image was just the foundation, though. Once people started paying attention to what I had to say, I realized I needed something much more valuable than good presentation. I needed to become truly indispensable, and that required understanding a completely different kind of power. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. Niccolo Machiavelli. After building my image, I thought I had it all figured out. Then I met Maria, and she taught me the difference between being noticed and being needed. Maria was our IT director at a consulting firm where I worked in Chicago, and honestly, she wasn't the most technically skilled person on her team. But when the company went through massive layoffs in 2020, guess who was the only person in IT they couldn't afford to lose? Maria understood something that Machiavelli knew centuries ago. Power comes from being necessary, not from being perfect. While her team focused on coding and system maintenance, Maria had quietly made herself the bridge between the technical world and the business side. She was the only person who could translate complex IT problems into language that executives understood, and more importantly, she was the only one who understood how technology decisions affected revenue. When the CFO needed to cut costs, he called Maria. When the CEO wanted to understand why a project was delayed, he called Maria. She had positioned herself at the intersection of two worlds that desperately needed to communicate. I watched Maria operate during a critical system upgrade that was running 3 weeks behind schedule. Instead of diving into the technical details like her team members, she focused on what the delay meant for each department. She personally called the heads of sales, marketing, and operations to explain how the timeline would affect their quarterly goals and what alternatives they could implement. By the end of that week, she wasn't just the IT director. She was the company's crisis communication specialist. The genius of Maria's strategy became clear when I compared her to David, our previous IT director. David was brilliant, probably the best programmer I'd ever met. But when executives had technology questions, David would launch into 20-minute explanations about server architecture and database optimization. His expertise was undeniable, but his value was limited to his technical domain. When budget cuts came, David's role was seen as replaceable because his skills, while impressive, didn't directly solve business problems. This taught me that being the best at your job isn't enough anymore. You need to be the best at solving problems that other people can't even articulate. I started looking for gaps in our organization, areas where important work was falling through the cracks because no one owned the connection points. I found my opportunity in client onboarding, which involved coordination between sales, legal, and delivery teams, but had no dedicated owner. I volunteered to streamline the onboarding process, not because I was passionate about project management, but because I saw 3 departments struggling to communicate effectively. Within 2 months, I had reduced onboarding time from 6 weeks to 3 weeks and eliminated the constant finger-pointing when things went wrong. Suddenly, I was getting calls from VPs in all 3 departments asking for my input on process improvements. The key insight I learned from studying both Maria and historical figures like Henry Kissinger is that indispensability comes from owning the spaces between official roles. Kissinger made himself essential to multiple presidents, not because he was the best diplomat, but because he was the only person with specific relationships and knowledge that couldn't be easily replicated. He understood that real power lies in being the unique solution to a critical problem. But there's a dangerous side to this strategy that I learned the hard way. I became so focused on being needed that I started hoarding information and making myself a bottleneck. When I went on vacation, 3 different projects stalled because I hadn't documented my processes or trained backup people. My manager Jennifer pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "You're not indispensable. If the company can't function without you, you're just a liability." That feedback forced me to evolve my approach. True indispensability isn't about being the only person who can do something. It's about being the only person who can do it at the level of quality and speed that the organization requires. I started documenting my processes and training others, but I maintained my unique value by constantly identifying new connection points and solving increasingly complex problems. The transformation was remarkable. Instead of being seen as a bottleneck, I became known as someone who could diagnose organizational problems and build sustainable solutions. When our company was acquired 18 months later, the new CEO specifically mentioned the onboarding system I'd created as one of the assets that made the acquisition attractive. That system had become more valuable than any individual skill I possessed. Looking back, I realized that Maria had unconsciously applied one of Machiavelli's core principles. Identify what people truly need, not what they say they want. Executives said they wanted better technology, but what they really needed was someone who could help them make informed decisions about technology investments. The gap between what people ask for and what they actually need. That's where indispensable value lives. But becoming indispensable was just the beginning of understanding real power. What I discovered next challenged everything I thought I knew about leadership and forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Niccolo Machiavelli. I used to think being a good leader meant being liked by everyone. That belief nearly destroyed my first management position at a marketing agency in Portland back in 2018. I had just been promoted to lead a team of 5 designers, and I was determined to be the cool boss who everyone wanted to grab drinks with after work. Within 3 months, deadlines were suggestions, quality was inconsistent, and my own manager was questioning whether I was cut out for leadership. That's when I learned that respect without consequences is just popularity, and popularity doesn't deliver results. The breaking point came during a campaign for our biggest client, a local restaurant chain. My designer Alex had missed his 3rd deadline in 2 weeks, and this time it was going to cost us the account. When I called him into my office, I started with my usual approach. "Hey Alex, I know you're doing your best, but we really need to talk about these deadlines." He actually interrupted me and said, "Look, I'll get it done when I get it done. Good work takes time." In that moment, I realized I had trained my team to disrespect not just me, but the entire process. That night, I called my mentor Robert, a former military officer who had transitioned into corporate leadership. He asked me one simple question that changed my entire approach. If someone consistently ignores your deadlines and faces no real consequences, what are you actually teaching them? The answer was obvious. I was teaching them that my words meant nothing. Robert explained that leadership isn't about being feared, but about being predictable. People need to know that actions have consistent outcomes. The next morning, I had a team meeting that felt completely different from any conversation I'd had before. Instead of asking for cooperation, I established clear expectations. From now on, when I set a deadline, that's a commitment to our clients, not a suggestion. If you miss a deadline without prior communication, you'll be removed from that project, and we'll discuss whether this role is still a good fit. The room went quiet. Alex looked shocked, but I could see something else in the other team members' eyes: relief. What happened next taught me everything about human psychology and respect. Within 2 weeks, my team was hitting every deadline, communication improved dramatically, and the quality of work actually increased. But here's what surprised me most. They seemed happier. During our next team lunch, Sarah, one of my senior designers, told me something I'll never forget. It's actually less stressful working for you now. Before, I never knew if deadlines mattered, so I was constantly stressed about everything. Now I know exactly what's expected. The key insight I learned is that firmness creates psychological safety, not fear. When people understand the rules and consequences clearly, they can make informed decisions about their behavior. Before I established clear boundaries, my team was operating in constant uncertainty. They didn't know which deadlines were real, which quality standards mattered, or what would actually get them in trouble. That uncertainty was more stressful than any firm leadership could ever be. But I also learned there's a crucial difference between being firm and being harsh. After establishing clear consequences, I made sure to recognize great work even more publicly than before. When Alex finally delivered an exceptional project 2 weeks ahead of schedule, I praised his work in front of the entire agency and sent a personal thank you email to his personal account. The combination of clear consequences and genuine recognition created an environment where people knew exactly how to succeed. 6 months later, our team had the highest client retention rate in the agency and had won 2 industry awards for campaign excellence. More importantly, 3 of my team members received promotions to other departments, and they all mentioned in their exit interviews that working on my team had improved their professional skills. That's when I understood that real leadership isn't about making people comfortable, it's about making them better. Our most powerful validation came during the annual performance reviews. Every single team member scored higher than the previous year, and the feedback was consistent. They appreciated having a manager who helped them understand how to succeed rather than hoping they would figure it out themselves. One comment from my review still gives me chills. For the first time in my career, I knew exactly what was expected of me and what would happen if I didn't deliver. It made me want to exceed expectations rather than just meet them. Looking back, I realized that what felt like being mean was actually the most caring thing I could do as a leader. By establishing clear boundaries and following through consistently, I gave my team the gift of predictability in an unpredictable industry. They could focus their energy on creating great work instead of guessing what I really meant when I said something was important. This experience taught me that Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was recognizing that clear consequences create the foundation for genuine respect. When people know that you say what you mean and mean what you say, they can trust you even when they don't like a particular decision. That trust becomes the basis for something much more powerful than fear or love alone. But mastering the balance between firmness and fairness was just one piece of the leadership puzzle. What I discovered next completely changed how I thought about loyalty, partnerships, and the dangerous assumption that today's allies will be tomorrow's friends. There are no more reliable foundations than good laws and good arms. Niccolo Machiavelli. The hardest lesson I learned about alliances came during a startup accelerator program in San Francisco in 2019. I was working on a fintech app with my co-founder Marcus, who had been my best friend since college. We'd spent countless nights dreaming about building a company together, and I genuinely believed our friendship would be the foundation of our success. By the end of the program, we weren't speaking, and I had learned why Machiavelli warned against confusing personal loyalty with strategic partnership. Our trouble started when we met another team working on a complementary product, a payment processing solution that could integrate perfectly with our app. The team was led by Angela, a former Goldman Sachs executive who knew the financial industry inside and out. Marcus immediately saw her as competition and refused to explore any collaboration. "We can't trust her," he kept saying. "She's just trying to steal our ideas." But I could see an opportunity for mutual benefit. that could accelerate both our timelines significantly. The accelerator environment was intense. 12 weeks to build something that could attract serious investor attention. While Marcus spent time building walls around our intellectual property, I started having quiet conversations with Angela about potential partnerships. Not behind Marcus's back, but despite his resistance. I realized that my loyalty to my friendship with Marcus was actually hurting our company's chances of success. Sometimes, the most loyal thing you can do is make decisions your partner disagrees with. Angela and I discovered that our products could create a complete ecosystem that neither could build alone in time for demo day. Her payment processing needed user-friendly interfaces. Our app needed robust payment infrastructure. Instead of competing for the same market, we could create a larger market together. But when I presented this opportunity to Marcus, he accused me of betraying our partnership. "It's supposed to be us against the world," he said. That's when I understood that emotional partnerships and strategic partnerships operate by completely different rules. I made the difficult decision to move forward with the integration in project, knowing it might damage my friendship with Marcus. We spent 2 weeks building a demo that showcased both products working together seamlessly. The result was powerful. We had created something that looked like a mature product suite rather than 2 separate startup experiments. But Marcus felt betrayed and started working on alternative solutions without telling me, essentially creating his own parallel partnership strategy. Demo Day revealed the wisdom of strategic flexibility. Our integrated presentation with Angela's team received the highest investor interest of any project in the accelerator. 3 VCs specifically mentioned the partnership as a key differentiator, and we ultimately received offers that were 40% higher than we would have gotten individually. Meanwhile, teams that had isolated themselves or formed partnerships based only on personal comfort received minimal interest. The aftermath was complicated but educational. Marcus and I eventually sold our portion of the integrated platform to Angela's team for a significant profit, but our friendship never fully recovered. He felt I had chosen business over loyalty. I felt he had chosen comfort over opportunity. Looking back, we were both right and both wrong. I had prioritized strategic success over personal relationships, but I could have communicated better throughout the process. What I learned from studying historical examples like Churchill's alliance with Stalin during World War II is that effective leaders separate personal feelings from strategic necessities. Churchill despised Stalin's ideology and understood the long-term threat of Soviet expansion, but he recognized that defeating Hitler required temporary cooperation with an ideological enemy. The alliance lasted exactly as long as it served both parties' interests, and both leaders understood that from the beginning. The key insight is that loyalty should be to principles and outcomes, not to people or processes. When I remained loyal to the goal of building a successful company, I made better decisions than when I remained loyal to Marcus's comfort level or our original plans. This doesn't mean betraying people. It means being honest about when partnerships need to evolve or end based on changing circumstances. 6 months after the accelerator ended, Angela and I maintained a professional relationship that led to 2 more successful collaborations. Marcus and I eventually rebuilt our friendship on a personal level, but we both learned valuable lessons about the difference between business partnerships and personal relationships. He admitted that his resistance to collaboration had been driven more by fear than by strategic thinking. This experience taught me to evaluate every partnership based on current value creation rather than historical relationships or future promises. I still maintain strong personal friendships, but I never again confused emotional loyalty with strategic alliance. Some of my closest friends today are people I've competed against professionally, and some of my most successful business relationships are with people I would never choose as drinking buddies. The most important principle I extracted from this difficult period is that temporary alliances aren't betrayals. They're acknowledgements that different goals require different partnerships. The startup world taught me that today's competitor can be tomorrow's acquisition target, and yesterday's co-founder might become next year's consultant. Flexibility in relationships, like flexibility in strategy, is a survival skill. But understanding alliance dynamics was just the beginning of mastering strategic timing. What I discovered next about recognizing decisive moments taught me that even the best partnerships mean nothing if you can't identify when to act. Opportunity makes the man, and not the man the opportunity. Niccolo Machiavelli. I learned about perfect timing in the worst possible way, by missing it completely. Back in 2017, I was working as a product manager at a software company in Denver when I identified what I thought was a brilliant opportunity. Our main competitor had just suffered a major data breach. Their customers were panicking, and our solution was objectively better. I spent 3 weeks building the perfect presentation, researching every detail, and crafting what I was sure would be an irresistible pitch to steal their biggest clients. By the time I was ready to act, the moment had passed, and I learned that opportunity has an expiration date. The first sign I had missed my window came when I called David Martinez, the CTO at one of our competitors' largest accounts. 3 weeks earlier, he had been fielding angry calls from his board about the security breach and openly questioning his vendor choice on LinkedIn. But when I finally reached him, his tone was completely different. "Thanks for thinking of us," he said politely. "But we've already implemented additional security measures and renewed our contract. The crisis actually made us stronger partners." What happened during those 3 weeks while I was perfecting my pitch taught me everything about how quickly windows of opportunity open and close. Our competitor had responded to the breach with immediate transparency, a comprehensive security audit, and direct communication with every affected client. Instead of trying to hide the problem, they used the crisis to demonstrate their crisis management capabilities. By the time I was ready with my perfect solution, they had already turned their biggest weakness into a competitive advantage. That failure sent me into deep research mode. I studied how successful people recognize and act on fleeting opportunities, and I discovered a pattern that changed how I approach every important decision. The people who consistently capitalize on timing don't wait for perfect preparation. They identify 3 critical factors and act when those align: urgent need, adequate preparation, and limited competition. The magic happens when all 3 converge, but that convergence usually lasts days or weeks, not months. 6 months later, I got my chance to apply this lesson. During a routine industry conference in Austin, I noticed something interesting in the hallway conversations. 3 different executives from major clients mentioned the same frustration. They loved our product, but hated our implementation process, which took 6 months and required extensive IT involvement. I heard variations of this complaint 4 times in 2 days, and I realized the market was telling me exactly what they needed. Instead of going back to Denver to research and plan, I spent that evening in my hotel room sketching out a simplified implementation service. By the next morning, I had outlined a process that could reduce implementation from 6 months to 6 weeks by handling most of the technical complexity on our end. When I presented this concept to those same executives during the final day of the conference, their response was immediate and unanimous. "When can we start?" The key insight I learned is that perfect timing rarely announces itself with fanfare. It usually looks like a series of small signals that most people dismiss as coincidences. Those complaints at the conference weren't random. They represented a pain point that had reached a tipping point across our entire market. The executives weren't just venting, they were essentially describing the exact solution they would pay premium prices to access. Within 2 weeks of returning from Austin, I had signed 3 pilot customers for the accelerated implementation service at twice our normal margins. The success of those pilots led to a complete restructuring of our service delivery model, and eventually to my promotion to Director of Customer Success. What started as overheard conversations at a conference became a 7-figure revenue stream because I recognized the convergence of need, capability, and opportunity. But the most important lesson came from comparing my conference success to my earlier failure with the data breach. In both cases, I had identified real market opportunities, but my response time made all the difference. When I spent 3 weeks perfecting my pitch, the market moved on without me. When I spent 3 hours sketching a solution and immediately tested it with potential customers, I captured value before anyone else recognized the opportunity existed. This taught me that timing isn't about predicting the future. It's about recognizing present conditions that create temporary advantages. The data breach created a moment when customers were willing to switch vendors, but that willingness lasted only until their current vendor demonstrated competence in crisis management. The conference complaints revealed a moment when customers were ready to pay for speed, and that willingness lasted only until someone offered them exactly what they wanted. I started applying a simple test to every potential opportunity. If I can't act on this within 2 weeks, I'm probably already too late. This isn't about rushing into bad decisions. It's about recognizing that most windows of opportunity are measured in days and weeks, not months and quarters. The market rewards speed of recognition and response, not perfection of preparation. The conference experience also taught me to always carry a decision-ready mindset. I had my laptop, access to our pricing models, and authority to commit resources because I had learned to prepare for opportunities I couldn't predict. When the right moment presented itself, I could act immediately instead of asking for permission or going back to research mode. But mastering timing was only part of the strategic equation. What I discovered next about managing my public image versus my private actions taught me that sometimes the most effective leadership happens when people don't realize they're being led. A prince ought never to move away from the good when possible, but must know how to enter into evil when necessity demands. Niccolo Machiavelli. The moment I understood the difference between being authentic and being strategically authentic happened during my worst performance review ever. It was 2019, and I was working as a business development manager at a consulting firm in Seattle. My boss, Karen, had just finished telling me that while my results were strong, my communication style was creating problems with clients and colleagues. When I asked for specifics, she said something that still makes me cringe. "You're too honest about things people don't need to hear. Not everything you think needs to be said out loud." The specific incident that triggered this feedback involved a client meeting where our project was running 2 weeks behind schedule. When the client asked about timeline, I immediately launched into a detailed explanation of every problem we'd encountered: the vendor delays, the scope creep, the internal miscommunications. I thought I was being refreshingly transparent. What I actually did was dump all of our organizational chaos onto a client who just wanted to know when their project would be finished and what we were doing to fix it. Karen explained that my colleague James would have handled the same situation completely differently. He would have acknowledged the delay, taken responsibility, presented a clear recovery plan, and saved the detailed explanations for internal discussions. "James tells the truth," she said, "but he tells the right truth at the right time to the right people. That's not being fake, that's being professional." That conversation forced me to examine the difference between honesty and strategic communication. I started studying how successful leaders navigate the gap between their private thoughts and public communication. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about authenticity. Leaders like Tim Cook genuinely believe in privacy rights, but they also leverage that stance to differentiate Apple from competitors who profit from data collection. His advocacy is both authentic and strategically advantageous, not because he's being manipulative, but because he's chosen to build his career around principles that serve multiple purposes. The breakthrough came when I realized that strategic authenticity isn't about hiding your true self. It's about choosing which aspects of your true self to emphasize in different contexts. I genuinely cared about project quality, client success, and transparent communication. But I had been expressing those values in ways that created anxiety rather than confidence. My honesty about problems was authentic, but it wasn't helpful to anyone except my own need to feel transparent. I started applying what I called the context test to my communications. Before sharing concerns or criticisms, I would ask myself, is this information helpful to this specific person in this specific situation, or am I sharing it because it makes me feel better? With clients, I focused on solutions and timelines rather than explanations of internal processes. With my team, I shared the detailed challenges because that information helped them do their jobs better. Same authenticity, different application. The transformation in my professional relationships was remarkable. Within 6 months, client satisfaction scores for my projects increased by 30%, and I received feedback that I had become much more executive ready. But the real validation came when Karen promoted me to senior manager and said something that completely reframed how I thought about leadership. You've learned to be authentic in service of others, not just in service of yourself. This experience taught me that Machiavelli wasn't advocating for deception. He was recognizing that effective leadership requires calibrating your communication to serve the situation and the people involved. When he wrote about princes needing to enter into evil, he wasn't suggesting cruelty. He was acknowledging that sometimes being kind to one person requires being firm with another, and effective leaders make those choices consciously rather than accidentally. The key insight I extracted is that you can be completely honest about your values and priorities while being strategic about how and when you express specific concerns. I never started lying about project status or pretending problems didn't exist. Instead, I learned to frame challenges in ways that help people make better decisions rather than just sharing information for the sake of transparency. A year later, I had the opportunity to mentor a junior colleague who was struggling with similar feedback about being too direct. I shared my experience and watched her make the same transition from reflexive honesty to strategic authenticity. She learned to lead with solutions rather than problems, to save detailed explanations for people who needed them to do their jobs, and to frame difficult conversations around outcomes rather than processes. Today, this principle guides every important conversation I have. I ask myself, what does this person need to hear to make the best possible decision or take the most helpful action? That question has never led me to lie or manipulate, but it has consistently led me to communicate more effectively. The goal isn't to control what people think. It's to serve their actual needs rather than my emotional need to share everything I'm thinking. This lesson about strategic communication became the foundation for understanding something even more powerful: how to influence outcomes without appearing to control them. What I learned next about invisible leadership completely changed how I approach every professional relationship. The best way to keep what you have conquered is not to give the impression that you have conquered it. Niccolo Machiavelli. I discovered the power of invisible influence during my first week as a project director at a marketing agency in Boston in 2020. My predecessor, Michael, had been fired for what HR diplomatically called management-style issues, but everyone knew the real problem. He micromanaged everything and made every decision feel like a battle he needed to win. When I took over his team of 8 creatives, they were defensive, cynical, and convinced that management was the enemy. I needed them to embrace ambitious new goals, but direct orders had already proven disastrous. Instead of announcing my vision for the department, I spent my first month asking questions. During one-on-ones, I would say things like, "What do you think is holding our team back from producing our best work?" Or, "If you could change one thing about how projects flow through our department, what would it be?" I wasn't fishing for specific answers. I was genuinely curious about their perspectives. But something interesting started happening. They began identifying the exact problems I had noticed and proposing solutions that aligned perfectly with my strategic goals. The breakthrough came during a team meeting in my 3rd week. Our designer Lisa mentioned that she felt like we were always reacting to client demands instead of proactively presenting creative options. What if we developed 3 strategic concepts for every brief, instead of waiting to see what they reject, she suggested. That was exactly the approach I had planned to implement, but coming from Lisa, it felt like the team's idea. Instead of taking credit, I enthusiastically supported her suggestion and asked her to lead the initiative. Within 2 months, our team had completely transformed their approach to client work, but they felt like they had driven the change themselves. We started presenting strategic concepts before clients even finished their briefs. Our win rate increased by 45%, and client satisfaction scores reached the highest levels in the agency's history. When our CEO asked what management changes I had implemented, I honestly told him, "I mostly just asked better questions and got out of their way." The genius of this approach became clear when I compared our results to Michael's tenure. He had tried to implement similar process improvements through direct mandates and detailed procedures. The team had complied reluctantly, the quality suffered from lack of buy-in, and eventually they pushed back hard enough to get him fired. Same goals, same team, completely different execution, and completely different results because they felt ownership instead of obligation. I learned this technique by studying leaders like Anna Wintour, who has controlled fashion industry trends for decades without appearing to dictate them. She doesn't announce what should be popular. She asks designers thoughtful questions about their inspirations, suggests subtle modifications during fittings, and creates contexts where the right ideas feel inevitable. By the time a trend appears in vogue, everyone involved feels like they contributed to its development. The key insight is that people resist being controlled, but crave being influential. When you create situations where others can discover and articulate the solutions you've identified, they become advocates instead of obstacles. This isn't manipulation. It's recognizing that the best ideas need emotional ownership to become successful realities. My team's creative solutions worked better than my mandates would have because they had invested their own thinking and reputation in the outcomes. But there's a crucial difference between invisible influence and passive leadership. I always had clear goals and strong opinions about quality standards. The invisible part was how I helped others reach conclusions that served those goals. During project reviews, instead of saying, "This concept doesn't work," I would ask, "What response are we hoping to get from their target audience?" That question guided them toward the same quality standards I had in mind, but through their own analytical process. 6 months later, when Lisa was promoted to Associate Creative Director, She thanked me for giving her the space to grow into a leader, but what I had actually done was create structured opportunities for her to exercise the leadership qualities I had recognized from day one. She became a better leader, not because I stepped aside, but because I designed situations where her natural abilities could emerge and be recognized by the entire team. The most powerful validation of this approach came during my annual review. 3 different team members had mentioned in their feedback that they felt more creative and confident under my leadership. One comment particularly stood out. "I feel like I'm finally working for someone who trusts my judgment and helps me think through problems instead of just telling me what to do." That feedback made me realize that invisible influence is actually the most respectful form of leadership. This experience taught me that real power isn't about making people do what you want. It's about helping them want what needs to happen. When people feel like co-creators rather than implementers, they bring creativity and energy that no amount of direction can generate. The team's 45% improvement in win rates happened because they were solving problems they had identified rather than executing solutions I had imposed. Today, I apply this principle in every leadership situation. Whether I'm running a team meeting, negotiating a contract, or even planning family vacations, I look for ways to guide the conversation toward discoveries rather than announcements. The goal isn't to hide my opinions, it's to create space for others to develop their own informed opinions that align with our shared objectives. But mastering invisible influence was just one piece of understanding how information really flows in organizations. What I learned next about the economics of knowledge taught me that what you know matters less than what you know first. A wise man does not and should not keep his word when keeping it is disadvantageous and when the reasons which made him pledge it are removed. Niccolo Machiavelli. I learned the real value of information during what should have been a routine quarterly business review in Atlanta back in 2018. I was working as a sales director for a software company, and our biggest client was considering switching to a competitor. During the meeting, their CTO mentioned they were exploring options and would make a decision in the coming months. Everyone else in the room heard a polite delay tactic, but I heard something different because I had been paying attention to information that others ignored. 3 weeks earlier, I had noticed something unusual in their job postings. They were hiring 2 new data engineers with specific experience in our competitor's platform. Most salespeople wouldn't monitor client job postings, but I had learned to track hiring patterns as early indicators of technology decisions. When companies start hiring people with expertise in a specific tool, they're usually planning to implement that tool within 6 months. The CTO wasn't exploring options. He had already decided to switch. That night, I called my contact in their IT department, someone I had cultivated over 2 years of regular check-ins that had nothing to do with sales. "Jennifer," I said, "I noticed you guys are building out your data team. That's exciting. What's driving the expansion?" She confirmed what I suspected. Their board had mandated a migration to our competitor's platform after a detailed cost analysis. The decision wasn't about functionality. It was about reducing their annual software spend by 30%. Armed with this information, I had 2 choices. I could follow our standard process and submit a competitive proposal, or I could acknowledge the reality and pivot our relationship. I chose a third option that surprised everyone involved. The next morning, I called their CTO directly and said, "Based on what I'm seeing in your strategic direction, I think our competitor's platform might actually be a better fit for your cost optimization goals. But I'd like to propose how we could help you transition successfully while maintaining our partnership in other areas." This approach completely changed the dynamic of our relationship. Instead of seeing me as a desperate salesperson trying to prevent an inevitable decision, the CTO began treating me as a strategic advisor who understood their business. We spent the next hour discussing their migration timeline, potential integration challenges, and how our consulting services could support their transition. By the end of that conversation, I had secured a six-figure consulting contract to help manage the very migration that was taking our software business away. The key insight I learned is that information has different values depending on how quickly you recognize its significance and how creatively you apply it. The job postings were public information that anyone could have accessed, but most people don't connect hiring patterns to strategic decisions. The cost analysis was confidential information, but it was shared with me because I had invested in a relationship with no immediate sales agenda. The combination of both data points gave me advantages that no one else in the situation possessed. 6 months later, when their migration hit predictable complications, guess who they called for help? Our competitor's sales team had disappeared after closing the deal, but I had maintained weekly check-ins and proactively identified potential problems. We ended up securing additional consulting work worth more than the original software license they had cancelled. More importantly, we became their preferred partner for future technology initiatives because I had demonstrated understanding of their business beyond just our product. This experience taught me that information advantage isn't about having access to secrets. It's about connecting data points that others treat as unrelated. I started systematically tracking indicators that most people ignore: conference speaker lists to identify industry trends, LinkedIn job changes to understand competitive moves, patent filings to anticipate product developments, and regulatory filings to predict market shifts. These information sources are completely public, but most people don't invest the time to synthesize them into actionable insights. The transformation in my sales performance was dramatic. Instead of reacting to opportunities when they appeared in traditional sales channels, I was identifying and approaching prospects during their early decision-making phases. My close rate increased by 60% because I was having conversations about problems before they became urgent, positioning solutions before competitors knew opportunities existed. But the most valuable lesson came from understanding the ethics of information advantage. I never used confidential information inappropriately or violated anyone's trust. Instead, I became genuinely useful to my contacts by providing insights about their industry, connecting them with relevant resources, and helping them solve problems that weren't directly related to my products. The information they shared with me was payment for the value I was creating in their professional lives. A year later, I was promoted to regional sales director, specifically because of my ability to predict market movements and identify opportunities ahead of the competition. What leadership didn't realize is that I wasn't predicting anything. I was just paying attention to information that was available to everyone, but processed by almost no one. The competitive advantage came from systematic analysis, not special access. This principle extends far beyond sales into every area of professional life. Whether you're job hunting, investing, or making strategic decisions, the people who consistently succeed are usually the ones who gather and synthesize information more effectively than their competitors. They read the industry publications that others skip, attend the conferences that others consider too expensive, and maintain relationships that others see as unnecessary until they need something. Today, I spend 30 minutes every morning reviewing information sources that most people in my industry ignore completely. Patent databases, regulatory filings, university research publications, international trade data, and startup accelerator demo days. This daily investment in information gathering has provided early warning signals for every major industry shift I've navigated successfully over the past 5 years. But having superior information was only part of the strategic equation. What I discovered next about controlling access and availability taught me that scarcity creates value even more powerfully than quality does. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Niccolo Machiavelli. I discovered the power of strategic scarcity by complete accident during my first year as a freelance marketing consultant in 2020. When the pandemic hit, I was working for a digital marketing agency in Minneapolis that laid off half their staff, including me. Desperate for income, I started offering consulting services to small businesses that suddenly needed to figure out online marketing. My initial mistake was saying yes to everyone who called, working 18-hour days, and charging rates that barely covered my expenses. I was abundant, available, and completely burned out. The turning point came during a particularly frustrating week when I had scheduled 7 client calls in 2 days and was juggling 5 different project timelines. During a call with a restaurant owner named Carlos, I found myself apologizing for being distracted and asking him to repeat his question. After we hung up, I realized that my desperation to take every opportunity was actually damaging the quality of service I could provide. That night, I made a decision that felt terrifying but changed everything. I would only take 3 new clients per month, regardless of demand. The psychological shift happened almost immediately. When I started telling prospects that I only had 1 remaining slot for August, their entire demeanor changed. Instead of trying to negotiate my rates down, they started asking what they needed to do to secure that slot. Sarah, who owned a boutique fitness studio, actually called me back within an hour of our initial conversation and said, "I've been thinking about our call, and I really don't want to miss this opportunity. When can we start?" Same services, same expertise. But suddenly, I was perceived as valuable rather than desperate. Within 3 months, I had raised my rates by 70% and had a waiting list of potential clients. But the most interesting part wasn't the money. It was how differently clients treated me when they believed my time was scarce. They came to meetings prepared, responded to emails quickly, and implemented my recommendations without the endless debates I had experienced when I was constantly available. Scarcity had created not just demand, but respect and urgency around our working relationship. The psychology behind this transformation fascinated me, so I started studying how successful professionals manage their availability. I discovered that top consultants, doctors, lawyers, and creatives all use some form of scarcity to signal value. It wasn't about being difficult or playing games. It was about recognizing that unlimited availability suggests unlimited need for work, which implies lower quality or desperation. When people have to wait for you, they assume there's a good reason. I learned to calibrate scarcity carefully after making some mistakes in the other direction. When I got too restrictive and started turning down good opportunities just to maintain exclusivity, I lost momentum and actually hurt my business. The sweet spot I discovered was maintaining about 70% availability, busy enough to signal value, but accessible enough to serve client needs effectively. Too scarce and you frustrate people, too available and you devalue yourself. The principle extends far beyond pricing and scheduling. I applied the same concept to my expertise by choosing to become known for one specific thing rather than trying to help everyone with everything. Instead of being a general marketing consultant, I positioned myself as someone who specialized in helping brick-and-mortar businesses transition to digital-first customer acquisition. This narrower focus meant saying no to certain types of projects, but it also meant becoming the obvious choice for the specific problem I solved best. The results were remarkable. My referral rate increased dramatically because people knew exactly when to recommend me, and my close rate improved because prospects weren't comparing me to general marketing agencies. When someone needed help transitioning their physical business online, my specialized focus made me seem like the scarce expert rather than one of many available options. Scarcity of expertise proved even more powerful than scarcity of time. A year later, I had built a sustainable practice with premium rates, ideal clients, and a reputation for delivering exceptional results. The business grew not because I became better at marketing or sales, but because I learned to manage perception through controlled availability. When I occasionally took on extra projects or extended my specialization, I was careful to frame those as special exceptions rather than evidence that my boundaries were flexible. The most valuable insight I gained was understanding the difference between artificial scarcity and earned scarcity. Artificial scarcity, limiting availability just to drive up prices, eventually backfires because it's not sustainable and clients sense the manipulation. Earned scarcity comes from genuinely being selective about opportunities that align with your expertise and capacity to deliver excellent results. The scarcity becomes real because you're actually choosing quality over quantity. This lesson transformed how I approach every aspect of professional positioning. I stopped attending every networking event and started being selective about which conferences would provide the most value. I stopped saying yes to every speaking opportunity and started choosing engagements that aligned with my expertise and audience. I stopped accepting every social invitation and started being more intentional about which relationships deserved my time and energy. Today, I maintain scarcity not as a manipulation tactic, but as a quality control mechanism. When demand for my time exceeds my capacity to deliver excellence, scarcity helps me serve my best clients at the highest level rather than disappointing everyone with mediocre service. The goal isn't to be difficult, it's to be valuable enough that people understand why good work requires boundaries. But managing scarcity was just one piece of understanding human psychology in professional relationships. What I discovered next about the fundamental human need for recognition taught me that feeding people's egos strategically might be the most powerful tool in any leader's arsenal. The way we live is so far from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done brings about his ruin rather than his preservation. Machiavelli. I learned the transformative power of strategic recognition during my second year as a team lead at a consulting firm in Chicago. My predecessor, Tom, had been universally disliked despite being technically brilliant. When I inherited his team of 6 analysts, they were demoralized, competitive with each other, and constantly looking for opportunities to transfer to different departments. The problem wasn't their capabilities. It was that Tom had hoarded all the credit for their excellent work while publicly criticizing their mistakes. Within 6 months, I had turned that same team into the highest performing group in the company. Not by changing their skills, but by feeding their fundamental hunger for recognition. The breakthrough came during my first major client presentation when our analyst Jessica had developed a data model that identified $20 million in cost savings for our client. Tom's approach would have been to present Jessica's work as our team's analysis, while positioning himself as the strategic genius. Instead, I opened the presentation by saying, Jessica Martinez discovered a pattern in your procurement data that none of us had considered. Jessica, would you walk the client through your methodology? The room's attention focused entirely on Jessica, and I watched her confidence transform in real time. What happened next taught me everything about human psychology and loyalty. After the presentation, Jessica didn't just thank me privately. She became my most dedicated advocate in every subsequent project. She started working longer hours, bringing me ideas she developed on her own time, and actively promoting our team's capabilities to other departments. When clients called with follow-up questions, she volunteered to handle technical calls that were technically above her pay grade. I had given her public recognition for excellent work, and she responded with exceptional effort. But the real magic happened when the other team members witnessed Jessica's recognition and began competing for similar acknowledgement. Instead of the toxic competition they'd shown under Tom's leadership, they started collaborating more effectively because they understood that good work would be credited appropriately. Mark began sharing data insights with colleagues because he knew his contributions would be acknowledged. Lisa started volunteering for challenging assignments because she trusted that success would enhance her reputation rather than just mine. I applied this principle systematically across every interaction. During team meetings, I made sure to specifically credit whoever had generated each significant insight. In email updates to senior management, I named the person responsible for each achievement rather than using passive language like "we discovered" or "the team developed." When clients complimented our work, I immediately forwarded those messages to the relevant team members and copied their supervisors. The time investment was minimal, but the impact on team motivation was extraordinary. The psychology became clear when I studied leaders like Richard Branson, who built Virgin's culture around public celebration of employee achievements. Branson understood that most people spend their careers feeling underappreciated and invisible to senior leadership. When a leader takes the time to publicly acknowledge specific contributions, they're not just giving professional recognition, they're satisfying a fundamental human need to be seen and valued. That satisfaction creates emotional loyalty that extends far beyond normal employment relationships. 6 months later, our team's client satisfaction scores were the highest in the company's history, and we had successfully retained every team member despite competitive recruiting from other firms. During performance reviews, every single team member mentioned feeling more motivated and confident in their work. But the most telling feedback came from Jessica, who told me, "This is the first job where I feel like my individual contributions actually matter and get noticed by people who can impact my career." The contrast with Tom's leadership style was stark and educational. Tom had believed that taking credit for his team's work would enhance his own reputation and advancement opportunities. What actually happened was that his team produced minimum viable work because they knew their extra effort wouldn't be acknowledged. His hoarding of recognition created a cycle where people stopped trying to excel, which meant there was less excellent work to take credit for, which hurt his reputation more than sharing credit ever could have. I learned to calibrate recognition strategically rather than just offering generic praise. Specific recognition for specific achievements works much more powerfully than general appreciation. Instead of saying, "Great job on the client presentation," I would say, "Your data visualization on slide 12 made the cost savings immediately clear to their CFO." Detailed acknowledgement proves that you were actually paying attention to their work rather than just offering obligatory appreciation. The most sophisticated application came when I started using recognition to shape behavior and culture. When I wanted to encourage more proactive communication, I publicly praised team members who had identified potential problems early. When I wanted to promote collaboration, I made sure to recognize instances where people had shared resources or insights across projects. Recognition became a tool for reinforcing the behaviors that served our team's strategic goals. A year later, when I was promoted to director, 3 of my former team members specifically requested to continue working with me in my new role. During exit interviews, HR noted that our team had the lowest turnover rate in the company and consistently rated leadership satisfaction higher than any other department. The investment in strategic recognition had created loyalty that extended beyond individual projects or even immediate team structures. Today, I apply this principle in every leadership context, but also in peer, relationships, and even personal interactions. Whether I'm acknowledging a colleague's contribution in a meeting, thanking a vendor for exceptional service, or recognizing my family members' efforts at home, I've learned that specific public appreciation creates emotional bonds that improve every subsequent interaction. The goal isn't manipulation, it's recognizing that people perform better when they feel valued for their individual contributions. But understanding how to build loyalty through recognition was just preparing me for one of the most difficult lessons in strategic thinking. What I learned next about knowing when to abandon investments and cut losses taught me that sometimes the most caring thing you can do is quit. In great adversities, it is where one best knows the virtue of men. The Niccolo Machiavelli. The hardest business decision I ever made happened on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, when I realized I was about to lose everything I had built because I was too stubborn to admit failure. I was running a digital marketing agency in Phoenix that I had started 18 months earlier with my business partner Rachel. We had grown to 12 employees and were generating solid revenue, but we were also burning through cash faster than a California wildfire. The writing had been on the wall for months, but I kept believing that one more big client or one more successful campaign would turn everything around. The moment of truth came during what should have been a celebration meeting. We had just signed our largest client ever, a regional restaurant chain worth $200,000 in annual revenue. Rachel was excited, but when I reviewed our financial projections that night, I realized this new contract would actually accelerate our path to bankruptcy. The project required hiring 3 additional staff members, upgrading our software systems, and investing in new equipment. Even if we executed perfectly, we would run out of operating capital within 4 months. That realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable question. Was I continuing this business because it had a realistic path to success, or because admitting failure felt like personal defeat? When I honestly analyzed our situation, I discovered we were competing in an oversaturated market with insufficient capital, unclear competitive advantages, and profit margins that couldn't sustain our overhead. The fundamentals were wrong, and no amount of effort or optimism could change the mathematical reality. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Rachel and our key employees. Instead of presenting another survival plan or asking for salary cuts, I did something that felt like professional suicide. I told them the truth. "We've built something impressive here," I said, "but the numbers don't support sustainable growth. I think we need to wind down operations over the next 60 days while we still have enough cash to handle severance and client transitions responsibly." The room went completely silent. Rachel was furious and accused me of giving up too easily, but our CFO actually looked relieved. "I've been waiting for someone to say this out loud," he admitted. "We've been postponing the inevitable for 6 months." That conversation taught me the difference between perseverance and stubbornness. Perseverance means working harder when the fundamentals are sound, but execution needs improvement. Stubbornness means working harder when the fundamentals are flawed, but admitting that feels impossible. The shutdown process was emotionally brutal, but strategically brilliant. Instead of letting the business die slowly through layoffs and declining service quality, we managed a controlled transition that preserved relationships and reputations. We helped our employees find new positions, transferred our clients to partner agencies, and closed all contracts honorably. Most importantly, we extracted every possible lesson from the experience and documented what we had learned about market positioning, cash flow management, and partnership dynamics. 6 months later, the strategic value of that retreat became clear. 3 of our former employees had landed better positions and were now referring consulting work to Rachel and me individually. 2 of our former clients called directly asking if we could help them with projects as independent consultants. The agency we had transferred our largest client to offered me a partnership opportunity because they were impressed with how professionally we had handled the transition. This experience taught me that strategic retreat isn't admitting defeat. It's optimizing resource allocation for future opportunities. Churchill's retreat from Dunkirk wasn't a military victory, but it preserved forces that later won the war. Netflix's decision to abandon DVD by mail wasn't admitting their original business model was wrong. It was recognizing that market conditions had changed and adaptation required abandoning profitable operations to invest in uncertain futures. I learned to recognize the warning signals that indicate when retreat is necessary rather than just difficult. When resource consumption exceeds 150% of projections without proportional results, when timelines expand 3 times original estimates without fundamental scope changes, or when market conditions shift to make original objectives irrelevant, continuing forward becomes wasteful rather than persistent. The most valuable lesson was understanding how to frame retreat as evolution rather than failure. When we announced the agency closure, we positioned it as transitioning to focus on higher value consulting relationships rather than going out of business. This framing was actually accurate. We were moving from a resource-intensive business model to a more sustainable approach that leveraged our expertise without the overhead burden. A year later, both Rachel and I were earning more money as independent consultants than we had ever made as agency owners, and we were working with better clients on more interesting projects. The relationships we had built during the agency continued to generate opportunities, but without the stress of managing employees, office leases, and equipment depreciation. The retreat had actually accelerated our professional development rather than derailing it. Today, I apply this principle to every significant commitment I make. Before starting any major project, I establish clear criteria for success and specific conditions that would trigger strategic withdrawal. This isn't pessimism, it's recognition that the most successful people know how to cut losses quickly to preserve resources for better opportunities. The goal isn't to avoid all failures, but to fail faster and cheaper when failure becomes inevitable. The agency experience also taught me to distinguish between temporary setbacks and fundamental problems. Temporary setbacks require persistence and creative problem solving. Fundamental problems require honest assessment and strategic pivoting. The difference often determines whether you emerge from difficulties stronger or weaker than when you started. But learning when to retreat was just preparing me for the most important lesson of all. What I discovered next about building systems that work without constant supervision taught me that true leadership means creating value that survives long after you've moved on to other challenges. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Niccolo Machiavelli. The moment I understood the difference between personal success and lasting impact happened during my exit interview from the consulting firm where I had worked for 4 years in Dallas. My replacement, David, was asking me to explain how I had managed to maintain such high client retention rates and team performance metrics. As I walked him through my approaches, I realized with horror that most of my methods existed only in my head. I had built personal relationships, developed informal processes, and created solutions that worked because of my individual involvement. When I left, most of that value would walk out the door with me. That realization kept me awake for weeks after starting my new position. I had considered myself a successful leader because my teams delivered results and my clients were happy, but I hadn't built anything that could function without my constant presence. Like Alexander the Great, who conquered vast territories that immediately fragmented after his death, I had created an empire of personal influence rather than sustainable systems. The success felt hollow when I understood how temporary it really was. The wake-up call became urgent 6 months later when David called me in frustration. 2 of our biggest clients had cancelled their contracts, citing changes in service quality and communication style. 3 team members had requested transfers to other departments, and the project management processes that had seemed seamless under my leadership were now creating bottlenecks and confusion. My replacement was intelligent and capable, but he was trying to operate systems that had never been properly documented or designed to work without their creator. This crisis forced me to completely rethink what real leadership actually means. I started studying leaders whose influence had survived their departure or death, and I discovered a consistent pattern. They had invested as much energy in building systems as they had in achieving immediate results. Ray Kroc didn't just build successful McDonald's restaurants. He created operational manuals so detailed that anyone could replicate the experience consistently. Walt Disney didn't just make great movies. He documented creative processes that continued generating acclaimed films decades after his death. In my current role as a regional director, I became obsessed with systematization. Every successful process, every effective communication template, every problem-solving methodology got documented in detail. But documentation alone wasn't enough. I needed to ensure that multiple people understood not just what to do, but why these approaches worked and when to adapt them. I started conducting monthly knowledge transfer sessions where team members would teach each other their specialized skills and insights. The real breakthrough came when I implemented what I called the succession test for every important function. Whenever someone on my team became uniquely valuable in a specific area, I would require them to train at least 2 other people to handle 75% of those responsibilities. This wasn't about making anyone replaceable. It was about making our capabilities resilient. When people knew their expertise would be valued and preserved rather than hoarded, they became more willing to share knowledge openly. 2 years later, when I was promoted to vice president and had to transition my entire department, the difference was remarkable. My successor inherited not just a high-performing team, but a comprehensive playbook for maintaining that performance. Client relationships continued smoothly because account management processes were documented and redundant. Project quality remained consistent because review criteria and feedback loops were systematized rather than intuitive. But the most powerful validation came 18 months after my transition. The department I had built was not only maintaining its previous performance levels, it was exceeding them. The team had taken the systems I had created and improved them based on their own insights and changing market conditions. They had become innovators rather than just implementers because they understood the principles behind the processes, not just the specific steps. This taught me that true leadership legacy isn't about being irreplaceable. It's about making excellent results inevitable, regardless of who's in charge. Marcus Aurelius understood this when he wrote his Meditations, creating philosophical frameworks that have guided leaders for 2,000 years. He wasn't trying to make himself immortal. He was trying to make wisdom accessible to future generations who would face similar challenges. The systematic approach I developed follows 3 pillars: processes that anyone can execute, people who are trained beyond their current roles, and principles that guide decisions when situations don't match existing procedures. Processes handle routine operations, people provide adaptation and innovation, and principles ensure consistency when facing unprecedented challenges. All three elements must work together to create sustainable excellence. Today, I evaluate every leadership decision through the lens of permanence. When I solve a problem, I ask, have I created a solution that will work when I'm not here to explain it? When I develop someone's skills, I ensure they can teach those skills to others. When I make strategic decisions, I document the reasoning so future leaders can understand not just what was decided, but why it was the right choice given the available information. The most fulfilling aspect of this approach is watching people exceed what I thought was possible when they're working within strong systems, rather than depending on individual heroics. Teams that understand both the what and the why of their operations become creative and confident in ways that micromanaged teams never achieve. They make better decisions because they understand the principles. They adapt more quickly because they're not waiting for permission. Looking back on all these lessons, from building digital presence to managing scarcity, from invisible influence to strategic retreat, I realized they were all preparing me for this final understanding. Individual tactics are useful, but systematic thinking is transformative. Machiavelli wrote, "The prince, not to help one person gain power, but to codify principles that would guide effective leadership across generations and circumstances." The real measure of strategic thinking isn't whether you can navigate current challenges successfully. It's whether you can create frameworks that help others navigate future challenges you can't predict. That's the difference between being a successful player and building a winning game. In our modern world, where change happens faster than ever, the leaders who matter most are the ones who build systems that adapt, evolve, and improve long after their creators have moved on to other endeavors.